think we have quite a lot of people in now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this masterclass on private equity and investment funds. This is another masterclass from the autumn season. We've got a great panel today, as you can see, and a lot to get through. So we hope that you enjoy this masterclass and get involved in the conversation. So we always start our practice area masterclasses with our learning outcomes. So by the end of this masterclass, you should know how to break into the practice area, know what work of a private equity investment fund solicitor involves, and know the key issues facing this practice area right now. Before we get going, I'm just going to quickly run through some house rules. First and foremost, please use the online question tool to post any questions that you have, and my colleague Liv will be posing them to our speakers at the end. And Liv will also try to keep an eye on if any relevant questions come up during the conversations too. Yeah, and also please use the tool if you have any audio or visual problems during the masterclass, and we'll do our best to help you. Just a reminder that the masterclass will be recorded. The recording of the session will be sent to all registrants in a follow-up email tomorrow and will also be available on our YouTube channel very shortly. Please feel free to also post the masterclass on social media using LCN hashtag LCN Masterclass. We usually get students posting on LinkedIn about their experience and what they learned, which is always great to see. And then finally, we have some fantastic masterclasses coming up over the autumn term. So please check out the lawcareers.net events page for all masterclasses that we're running this term. Our next one is on next Thursday, the 17th, and it's all about how to make successful law firm applications. And with the application season upon us, I'm sure a lot of you will be quite interested in this one. So make sure to register. We also have another practice area masterclass coming on the 23rd of October, which is all about MA. So we'd love to see you at any of these events. Okay, so before we get started, I'm going to begin by asking all attendees to answer the question on the screen, so our panelists can get an idea of who's joining us today. Seems that majority of you are either second or third year law student, a postgraduate, or in work. And then we have some non-law students and a couple of first year students. And then I would also like to do another poll, which will give us an idea of how much you might already know about the practice area. So if you could please also answer that one. Seems like majority of you actually already know a little about the practice area, which is good. Hopefully we'll get some great questions, and some of you also know absolutely nothing, which is totally fine, because again, this is what the session is for. Thank you for answering that. It's great to see how prepared you are. So I think we're just about ready to start the conversation with our panelists. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Liv, who will, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Timothy. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us here today. We're just going to start. We've got a lot to get through, so we're just going to start off with a brief introduction from each of our panelists, and I'm just going to go with the order that I can see you all on my screen. So, Leanne, if we start with you, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. My name is Leanne Wright, and I am a partner at Osborne Clarke. Osborne Clarke has quite a large private equity practice, mostly operating in the mid-market. We act for both private equity investors and management teams. My specialism is in advising the senior management team, so CEO, CFO, who run the underlying business involved in an investment, who are getting shares in the business alongside the private equity investor.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Julian, you're next.
Hi, everyone. I'm an associate in the Skadden London private equity team. I've been there for about 4 years. I originally trained at CMS, where I also qualified and moved after about a year and a half. Studied at the University of Bristol, did law. And yeah, at Skadden, I primarily work in sort of sponsor-led private equity transactions. So sort of across from Leanne, where she represents management and we represent the investors.
Amazing, thank you. That's really useful. Priya?
Sure, I'm an associate in the Weil PE team in London. I've been here about a year. I trained at Chance and moved after 4.5 years or so. Similar to Julian, I act mainly on the sponsor-led side. So yeah.
Fab. And then finally, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Stewart. I'm a senior counsel in Travers Smith Investment Funds team. So you'll note that I am an investment funds lawyer, not a private equity lawyer. I work in the investment funds team. We work on establishing the actual funds that then go on to acquire private equity assets. We also have a big private equity team here at Travers Smith, but I work on the investment funds part of the business.
Fab. Thank you so much, everybody. And Sarah, just sticking with you to get us started, I thought it'd be quite good to have like a definition of private equity and investment funds. So what are the two? How are they similar, connected, and what are the main differences between them?
Okay, so starting off with what private equity is, and to be honest, it can cover a multitude of things, but it's really talking about the acquisitions and investments in the private market space. So that's talking about acquiring companies or sort of large controlling stake in private companies, or potentially listed companies and taking them private. But it's not, for example, what we see things like hedge funds doing, which is acquiring daily traded shares in listed entities, or, for example, financial instruments. So it tends to be buying companies, investing in companies and assets of that type. And the rest of the guys on the team are more in that private equity space of doing those deals and acquiring those interests. Where I sit is in investment funds, and I would say that investment funds is broader than just private equity funds. So there are a lot of other strategies like credit, real estate, infrastructure, that kind of thing. But what we do in the investment funds team is we bring the investors, and that can be a whole load of institutional investors, pension scheme money, that kind of thing, into these funds, matching up with general partners and sponsors and giving the money that then can be spent on acquiring those private equity assets. And I think the difference is there that, you know, they're just two sides of the same coin. In the life cycle of a fund, we're at the first initial stages of it because you need the money, you need the infrastructure there, and then that's giving everyone the dry powder to go off and do those deals.
That's great, thank you. And I guess just off the back of that, what would you say are the different types of private equity funds?
So I think traditionally there's a few different types of private equity funds. Obviously, with innovation in the sector, that's always increasing and people are trying to find their little bit of the market. But generally, there's kind of a differentiation between things like venture capital funds, which are obviously investing in early stage startups, higher risk capital, versus leverage buyout funds, which is talking about buying portfolio companies at a later stage in their development, but beyond sort of the venture stage. And then there's probably an area which is more about growth capital, which is allowing quite mature and developed companies to expand and grow. And they're probably the sort of different stages that we traditionally used to see. Increasingly in this sector, there's also things like funds of funds, which is private equity funds investing in other private equity funds. And in conjunction with that are secondaries funds, which go in and invest in the secondaries market and buy up stakes in other investment funds. That wasn't probably a feature of the market 5-10 years ago, but it's a big part of the market now.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And yeah, we've had a broad kind of introduction to the practice area, the different sides of the practice area. I wondered if you could just outline the different types of lawyers that work in this area.
Yes, of course. So, I mean, we are transactional lawyers. So most of what we do, we hope, isn't contentious. Although there's sort of lots of negotiation that goes on, and you need a huge number of lawyers in different practice areas to do a private equity transaction. all parties are generally trying to get to the same place, and so most deals are fairly collaborative. So much of what we do involves tax structuring. Obviously, we need lawyers like Sarah to help us even get started. And so, you know, when you say you are a private equity lawyer, you're in a sense, you are a corporate lawyer. I like to think of private equity as M&A with glitter. You are a corporate lawyer, but there's this whole additional piece, which is the investment piece that goes alongside what you're doing. But I think it's not quite right to say that although I'm a private equity lawyer, there aren't lawyers in other practice areas that have a huge amount of expertise and specialism in dealing with private equity funds and companies, and we need those people to have that expertise. So you often have employment lawyers that specialise in working with private equity businesses, certainly tax lawyers that specialise in working with private equity businesses or on private equity transactions, because it's this sort of huge beast of a thing that involves lots of lawyers in order to make it work.
Brilliant, thank you. And then just off the back of that, how would you say the transactions differ between private equity and corporate?
Sure. So because of tax structuring, the way most private equity deals work is if a private equity house isn't interested in running the business, and so they essentially back the management team, the existing team, as well as sort of backing the financial metrics of that business. So the way a deal tends to be structured is a new company is set up. It buys the whole of the underlying business, which is the M&A piece, right? That's a normal share deal. And then what happens is some of the shareholders that have sold, that are staying in the business as workers, they reinvest back into that new company alongside the private equity investor. So you essentially have a structure at the top that has the PE investor and also the people working in the business. So the way it's different is that you've essentially got two transactions here that we're negotiating. The first one is that M&A piece, and the second one is that glitter I spoke about, which is we're all in business together and we've all got a stake in this business. How is it going to be run? Who is going to control what in terms of how the business is run? And what happens in particular if that management team decide to leave the business, or the PE investor decides that they're no longer the right people to run the business? What happens to everybody's value? And then the final point you're trying to negotiate is a private equity house tends to, not all of them, but most of them, they like to invest for 3 to 5 years, and they like to get 3 times their money when they sell. So a lot of what we're negotiating is we're trying to future-proof the business to get everybody to that exit where everybody can sell their stake again and make lots of money.
Thanks, yeah. And then just rewinding slightly, you mentioned employment lawyers, for example, having expertise in private equity. How specialist is the work that you do? Do you just do this sort of work?
So I do. I think it's worth saying that lots of private equity lawyers start as corporate lawyers, as in, you know, doing mostly M&A, and lots of private equity lawyers also do other corporate work. It tends to be, if you are in a firm that has quite a large private equity practice, then actually most of the then you tend to split your team. So you have your normal corporate team and then your private equity team that just do PE transactions. So if there is a reason for me to do work on a transaction that isn't private equity, that's just normal M&A, because I've got a relationship with a client or something, then I will do that. But other than that, almost all of my work is working on PE deals.
Perfect, brilliant, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And then I thought it'd be quite nice for our attendees today to kind of get an idea of the sorts of clients that you all work for. So Priya, perhaps we could start with you on that.
Yeah, sure. So as Leanne mentioned about different team structures, the Weil team is called PIMA, but I sit more in the private equity side of that team. And as a result, I tend to work with a mixture of the bigger PE houses like Advent, Bain, and PAI, and then also some more growth clients such as Blackstone Growth and PSG. So I get a nice mixture, but yeah, less so on the.
Brilliant, thank you there. And Julian, is that similar for you?
Yeah, I think that's quite similar. We probably don't have quite as much growth. So sort of mostly large sponsors like BlackRock, HG, I Squared, those sorts of investors. A relatively big chunk of what we do is also probably similar to Priya is portfolio company work. So investors acquire these companies, as Leanne sort of said, with a horizon to exit probably within 4 to 7 years usually. And during that period, they hold the hold period of that investment. They maintain the companies. So, there might be management changes. They might acquire smaller companies to sort of integrate into that investment company. And we help with that stuff as well. So maintaining those companies is also quite a big part of our job.
Thank you. And Leanne, do you have anything else to add to that in terms of the clients?
Yeah, so just my firm does act for sponsors, much smaller sponsors sponsors who invest a much lower amount than Priya and Julian's clients, and then I will act for management teams, as I've said, the people actually running the business.
Perfect, thank you. And then Sarah, what does that look like for you?
So Travers Smith act for quite a lot of mid-market funds. We act for, obviously we have a PE team who work for some of the really big outfits and also some of the mid-market funds. Within the investment funds space, I actually specialise in investing on behalf of institutional investors. So my clients generally are pension schemes, institutional investors, insurance money investing into the funds.
Perfect, thank you everybody. And Julian, just coming back to you, what would you say a typical day in the life of a private equity lawyer looks like in terms of the problems and issues that you find yourself dealing with?
Well, I think first of all, if you ask any lawyer at any law firm, they're probably never going to have a typical day, but I can try my best. I think a big feature, I can sort of highlight the key features of my day maybe. I think a big feature of any corporate or private equity lawyer's day is going to be managing your to-do list and reprioritizing as things change, because a big feature of, I think, the types of transactions we work on is that there's a lot of sort of bits that can change the entire way the legal piece works. And often they're not finalized by the time we start our work. And oftentimes they can change very shortly before we think everything's done and we're about to sign our contract. And then someone's like, oh, actually, the tax structuring has changed and we've got to amend the way this works. So that happens pretty regularly. And I think in that instance, you need to be able to adapt to that and reprioritize how to get the deal done and the timeline your client wants to get it done in. So I think that's quite a big part of it. And then that flows into sort of making a plan and also managing a team, which I actually think is quite an underrated part of being a lawyer and people forget about quite easily. Like ultimately, we always work in teams in private equity, irrespective of what firm you work at, what type of work you do. You're going to be working as a team, both in your department, but also across the firm with other specialists. And you need to communicate with these people. You need to make sure everyone's working towards the same timelines. Everyone's feeding into that final work product so it can go to the client as a sort of ready, finished, polished product that they're happy with in the timings that they were expecting. So I think that's also a really big part of what we do, not just delivering a really good product, but also delivering it on time or ideally early. I think all of that kind of flows into what our day ends up looking like, which is ultimately talking to a lot of people all the time. I spend a lot of time on calls. I spend a lot of time emailing people. And that's, that goes down to sort of getting their inputs on things because they're specialists in certain areas like tax or employment or IP or data protection. It goes to speaking to your client all the time, making sure that you know what they want, what their priorities are, what their sort of key focus areas on a deal are when you're negotiating it with the other side's lawyers. But also a really big part, I think, of our job is understanding what your counterparty is looking for. So, for example, a management team, or for example, a seller. Because while that seems really straightforward, it's not. And there's this really weird shift for a client when they're buying a company or selling a company where they've been negotiating this deal for a solid number of weeks, sometimes months, and then they get their lawyers involved. So they've been working on it for a long time. And then the lawyers come in and suddenly everything starts going through the lawyers because it's all in the contract. So they've been used to negotiating the stuff directly with their counterparty. And suddenly now they're negotiating it through Chinese whispers through their lawyers. And things very frequently will get lost in translation, and lawyers will misinterpret what their clients wanted or go a bit further than their clients intended and send the wrong message and that sort of thing. So a really big part of it is communicating and making sure you know what the other side wants, you know what your client wants, and getting everyone to sort of agree the deal, because that's ultimately the great thing about being a corporate or a private equity lawyer, right? You're all kind of working towards a common goal. You're not in litigation with each other. You're not trying to sort of best each other. You're just trying to get a deal done.
Thanks, Julian. That was really interesting. And we've spoken a little bit about kind of what private equity is, what investment funds is, the sorts of clients we work with, the different types of lawyers in this area. Priya, I wonder if you could just outline the sectors that you tend to work in.
Yeah, no problem. So I would say personally, I work across a range of sectors, and I think that's generally true for most people that work in private equity. It's a product of the fact that our clients tend to be relatively sector agnostic, and so that flows through to the deals that we're working on. That being said, I think a lot of firms, not all firms, tend to have like sub-sector teams. So, for example, infrastructure, where there tends to be a little bit more specialized knowledge. So for those that don't know what I mean by infrastructure, it just means things like utilities or transport, things like that. And given that area requires a bit more specialist knowledge, you do sometimes see kind of sub-sector focus in an area like that. But yeah, generally speaking, I'd say it's kind of across all sectors. And I think it's a good thing. It's a kind of benefit of the job. It means that the job's quite interesting because you're never kind of doing repeated work in that sense, always learning about new issues and solving for new problems that come up depending on the nature of the business. So yeah, a good mix, I would say.
Brilliant, thank you. And then just drawing off that, and also off of Julian's typical day, for want of a better phrase, is this the kind of work where the flow is quite steady? Are there kind of crazy busy periods and then really quiet periods? How does that tend to work, Priya?
So I think there does tend to be peaks and troughs, and I think that's natural for the way that the deals are often structured. So often you'll see that processes are run as auctions. So this means there's multiple bidders looking at a particular transaction. And so in order to keep competitive tension and to keep kind of all the parties interested, the sell side will often run quite a tight timeline to keep everyone focused on achieving a goal and also achieving a competitive price for that target. So as a result of that, it means timelines can be quite tight. And then given so many deals being run as auctions, you often see certain bidders wanting to preempt deals. This means essentially bypassing the timeline altogether, accelerating it, as quickly as they can to make sure they're the first one to the table, with all the docs sorted, etc. And so that dynamic tends to result in quite contracted deadlines, timelines, and quite crazy peaks. That being said, when things are calmer, it doesn't mean that you're kind of sat idle. Like Julian's touched on this already. There's often quite a lot of either portfolio company work to manage, but also management incentive plan work. So this is what Leanne was describing about making the glitter, as you called it, kind of maintaining that. So once the management teams are kind of invested into the business, you might have to deal with things like management individuals leaving the business or new management joining the business. So even when it is a bit quieter and you're kind of off the back end of a deal, you'll find that you've still got enough to keep you ticking over with the other work streams.
Thank you. And is that a similar pattern for you, Sarah?
I think in investment funds, I'd say the peaks are not as high and the troughs are not as low. There are peaks and troughs and there are demands, and deadlines, but our fundraising process is a much more elongated process. So right from you get involved right at the outset when managers are developing their concepts and ideas for a fund and producing marketing documents. And then there's a closing process where you negotiate with investors to bring them into the vehicles. All of that, a fundraising process can take a couple of years. So you can be working on the same project for a couple of years. Within that, there'll be deadlines. There'll be really busy periods where you're having to turn a lot, but it's not quite the same as the deal making, adrenaline rush of the PE side of it. So.
Brilliant, thank you. And then just sticking with you, Sarah, how international is this area of law?
For investment funds, it's really international. We do quite a lot of work with English managers, English partnerships, but also the reality is that we work with structures that have structures in the US, in places like the Cayman Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, and increasingly Luxembourg and Ireland. So those are the kind of major fund jurisdictions. And even if you have a kind of UK-based partnership, you may well have a bolt-on of a fund or a parallel vehicle that's in one of those other jurisdictions. So inevitably, you get involved with working with lawyers in other jurisdictions. And equally, your investors tend to come in from other places, that they're not all domestic. So you're having to problem solve for their issues that are coming in from their domicile. So yes, very, very, very international.
Brilliant, thank you. And then on the other side of that, Julian, is that the same, would you say, or slightly different?
Yeah, I think private equity on the transactional side is pretty unique in how much exposure you get to other jurisdictions. Primarily because of what Leanne was saying earlier, that it's split into sort of two parts: the acquisition part, where you just buy a company, and then the investment part, where everyone invests and agrees the terms on which they invest higher up. Almost always that will be in two different jurisdictions for the work that I tend to do. Not always, but I'd say like 90% of the time. Which goes to sort of what Sarah was saying around funds tending to be incorporated in places like Luxembourg or the Cayman Islands, or sort of having structures that involve those jurisdictions. And then our investment documentation will also be governed by those laws of where the holding companies sit. So, for example, we have clients who often work in Luxembourg. So I'm very well acquainted with Luxembourg Local Council and work with them on pretty much every deal, because ultimately these documents are then Luxembourg law governed, right? So we still negotiate them because ultimately their content is commercial and their content is just what our client wants those documents to say. But there's always local law quirks that you need to make sure you reflect properly. And while we can do that for English law, we can't do that for other law. There's also, that's the investment part, right? And the acquisition part is ultimately determined usually always by where that company is located. So I've done a lot of deals sort of in the US. I've done some in France and Germany, sort of across Europe, and back at CMS, done a lot of stuff in Asia as well. So that's not uncommon at all. And again, you get local counsel involved. You find out what the weird and funny things they do are in that country, and you make sure that you sort of comply with them. But ultimately, I think that sort of distinguishes you as a private equity lawyer from a lot of other jurisdictions, because clients might go to a German lawyer directly if they're trying to buy a German company, whereas they're not necessarily going to do that for private equity, because they want to use the lawyers that know how to structure their investment part and not just their acquisition part. So that's where we tend to manage the entire process.
Brilliant, thank you very much. As you've I feel like we've got a good introduction to the area, sorts of work that you all get up to. Leanne, I wondered if you could just describe your journey into this particular area of law. How did you come to be practicing it? What made you decide to pursue this particular area of law?
Sure. So I'm one of those sad people where being a lawyer was their childhood dream. And so, I went to university and did law as my undergrad. I wanted to be a corporate lawyer by the time I was 18, and I was starting to fill in applications saying, what kind of lawyer do you want to be? And I thought, damn, I better figure this out. The reason why is because I'm really interested in business, but I have absolutely no creativity or appetite for risk. So I was never going to be the kind of person, obviously as a partner, I do own and run part of a business, but that's very different to setting one up and, and figuring out what's good and all that kind of thing. But I love being close to business, and I love feeling like the work that I do helps make business happen. And so, it was always going to be the destination for me. The journey was a little less conventional than originally planned. After university, for personal reasons, I had to move back to Lincolnshire to be at home. So I actually did my training contract in my local high street firm, which was great experience, made me a much better, well-rounded lawyer. But I couldn't do a sort of traditional corporate seat, let alone work on a private equity transaction. So showing my age, I used to go into the office on the weekend and read the physical corporate Bibles that the firm had, and then come in on a Monday morning and ask all the questions of the one corporate lawyer in the firm. Then I phoned a recruiter halfway through my training contract and said, I'm going to qualify about with January, said I'm going to qualify in September. Get me into a corporate team and I'll get you your commission. That's what I said to him. It was the arrogance of youth. But he managed to find a firm that had been let down by March NQ, and they were willing to take me on and let me transfer my training contract to them. So I moved to a corporate team in Nottingham and spent a few years as a corporate lawyer, doing a mix of M&A, mix of PE, corporate reorganisations, that kind of thing. I got poached by Eversheds and went there for a bit, and then I moved to Mishcon, where I started doing PE deals proper, acting for management. As I said, the reason why I act for management teams is because I'm interested in business, and if I work with the CEO, which is an incredibly lonely job, so you really do become the trusted advisor on it and learn all about them as an individual. I get to find out what makes the business tick by working with the senior management team, and these people are so amazing and interesting. And don't get me wrong, I don't adore all of my clients as much as some of the others, but they're really interesting people. And so I made a decision some time ago. I used to act on both sides, both sponsors and for management, but I decided that I would pursue just acting for management teams because I prefer it. And so my whole business case for partnership and progression was to be one of the leaders of my firm's management advisory practice. Sorry, long story.
No, that was great. Brilliant insight. Thank you so much. And Julian, was your journey fairly similar, or were there differences to yours?
Yeah, mine was a lot more straightforward, and I had to show a lot less grit to get through mine, I'd say. I originally went to school in Germany. I'm German, and came to the UK for uni when I went to Bristol, and studied law there. But at that point, had no real intention to be a corporate lawyer or sort of become a lawyer at all. It was just a degree I thought was quite a good foundation to do a lot of things, which I think still applies. And also at that point, had no idea that you could become a lawyer without being a law student and just do a law conversion course. So I wish I'd known that at the time, because probably would have studied something else. But yeah, so I did that, and then I did the LPC, or what's now called the SQE. And I had a training contract at a firm called, at the time, SJ Berwin, but then Kingwood Mallisons. And during my LPC, they unfortunately went bankrupt. So I lost my training contract there, but managed to sort of wrangle another one with CMS, and started there. Did my training, did a seat in private equity, which was really interesting, and I thought reflected what I enjoy about being a private equity lawyer now, because it's sort of a mixture of being fast paced, which I think a lot of people always think is a negative thing, but I really like, because I'd rather not be stuck on a really long, sort of arduous deal with people I might not really like very much. You never know, for 3 years, because that can happen in a corporate deal, or even like on litigation, you could do it for 5-6 years. Whereas in PE, you might just do a deal for 2 weeks and then it's over. And you've ticked the box. You've done a really good deal, and you've sort of might not have enjoyed it, but it was only 2 weeks. Whereas sometimes you enjoy them, and then that's fine as well. But I think it's ultimately more of like, I enjoy the sort of switching around, getting new experiences, and not being sat on the same thing for a really long time. The other part of it as well is that the clients you work with in PE are like uber sophisticated. They really know a lot about what they're doing, and they do it every single day. And I mean, they often know stuff about law that as a junior associate I had no idea about, right? Like they're more qualified than I am half the time. And that's, I think, really impressive, and leads to incredibly complicated and advanced work that you get to do as a result of your clients being so sophisticated and having the ability to be so creative in solving problems, which you wouldn't get on normal corporate deals, just because they haven't got the experience to even suggest some of the things they want to do. And I think the other really big thing is, which I wouldn't say is unique to PE, but which is still a feature of PE alongside the other things I like, is that you're not just a legal advisor, but you're also sort of a commercial advisor, which goes to the similar point that Leanne was saying around sort of enjoying business and being interested in it. And I'm the same, and I really, really am interested in business, but again, have no good ideas, so can't make a business up. So I just really enjoy sort of advising people on what might be a good commercial solution to a problem, and you get to speak about the economics of a deal with your clients, rather than just telling them, look, this clause is a bit off, we should redraft it, which is obviously a feature of being a lawyer, but it's not sort of the be all and end all.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And Sarah, Julian mentioned there doing a seat in private equity during a training contract. Would you say doing a seat in either private equity or investment funds is important for getting into this particular area of law, or are there other ways to get into it?
Look, I think, these areas have got bigger and increasingly specialised over the years. So it's definitely an advantage to have done a seat, and most people will have done a relevant seat before they apply. However, as Leanne had alluded to, a PE lawyer, a funds lawyer, you're generally a corporate lawyer. And therefore, I have seen lots of examples of people moving between practices, trainees having only sat in an associated, but not directly in that seat, but there's been enough NQ places come up. If you're good, partners talk to each other, they know who's good. There are ways of filling places within a firm when you're wanting to keep all the good people, and you can develop, and as long as you've shown the right kind of skills, at the end of the day, it's only 6 months, and there's time to catch that up. And I've equally also seen that, at the early stages of career, people have pivoted. I've definitely had PE people who've decided to pivot more into the funds side of it. So yes, I think, if you know that's what you want to do, the advice probably would be, make sure you get a seat there, set yourself up really well for getting on. But, there's lots and ways of means of moving across, and don't give up if you've decided, too late in the day that that's what you want to do. Go and talk to the right people, and there's definitely sort of not necessarily barriers there to you moving.
That's great, thank you. And I'm just looking at the questions coming in, Sarah, and someone has asked specifically for you, what made you choose to go into investment funds? What was it that attracted you to that work specifically?
I think I liked corporate work and I liked deals, but I didn't necessarily want to be burning them more than midnight oil, but doing, round the clock deals. Particularly, I started out my life actually doing listed funds products, which is very different from what I do now in the private equity space. But what we found there was we have, external boards that have to approve everything. The external boards are not sitting at 4 a.m. and approving anything. They're approving something that works out in their diaries in 3 weeks' time. So you work to slightly a different a pace. There's a lot of work to do, and it tends to be volume that keeps you late rather than necessarily that we all have to agree this before we go home tonight. So it's a nice mix of the two.
Thank you. And Priya, Sarah mentioned there being able to kind of show the skills necessary to be a lawyer in this particular area of law. What would you say are the key skills that someone would need to be successful in this area of law?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think Julian's touched on both of the things I was going to say, which is, to my mind, the key skills, the base skills, communication skills and creative problem solving and strategic thinking. So on the communication side of things, you're dealing with really complex matters, and it's in a typically quite fast-paced environment. And as a result of that context, you need to learn pretty quickly to be able to explain quite complex matters in a really succinct and digestible format. And that applies both when communicating to your client, but also internally when working within your team, both upwards kind of to more senior people, but also when managing, more junior lawyers or trainees. It's not uncommon to be on multiple transactions at any given time, and that will be the case for everyone else you're working with as well, and for your clients often as well. So communication is a really key one for the nature of the work that we do. And it's great when your clients are super sophisticated and they know what's going on, but we've all had situations where clients aren't necessarily as familiar with certain concepts or ideas, or it's their first time doing a particular type of structuring or something on the transaction. And so actually learning to communicate in a way that's kind of being conscientious of that, but kind of still respectful, mindful of them being your client. I think that's definitely a certain skill that it takes to develop. And then, with the creative problem solving and strategic thinking, I think increasingly we're not seen as just legal counsel, we're seen as kind of more commercial advisors. I completely agree with Julian on that. And that means not just navigating the complex issues with, over-engineered drafting or over-lawyering of documents. So clients are looking to us to take into consideration what their kind of commercial aims are and achieve that in a way that doesn't kind of over-lawyer things. You can kind of focus on what their aims are, so to speak. And so that requires being kind of quite clever and creative with how you approach not just your legal drafting, but also especially around structuring a lot of the time as well, where you working with the other advisors, tax advisors, etc., that are involved on those work streams as well. So I think those are probably the base skills that kind of remain the same and kind of critical as you progress through your career. Obviously, as you get more senior, different other important skills come into play, but those two I think are the foundational skills.
That's great, thank you. And then I suppose, Leanne, as a partner, what would you say, Priya mentioned there, the skills changing and developing, what would you say those skills are, and how would you say your skill set's developed over the years?
Yeah, I would say it's actually just sort of building exactly on, and I agree with everything that Priya has said. I think it kind of goes back to these parties are going into business together, and they're going to be stuck with each other for a good few years. And so it's not like a normal if you buy and sell a piece of real estate, you complete the deal and then the parties go their separate ways. This deal is a coming together, and so both sets of clients have got to live with each other and work together after the deal. And so I think Julian was saying earlier about really understanding what the other side wants and needs to be protected. What we do is give both sides the comfort that they need in order to go into business together. And so, building on all of the things that Priya has said, when you are sort of stepping away from drafting and the detail of each individual document, it's really about knowing when to negotiate and when not to, I think, and making sure that your client really understands the issue, but also that you're telling them when to drop it and when to not worry about it. And if you are the kind of person that wants to be a lawyer who wins, you should not go into this area of law, because although we're all high performing competitive people, trying to win is the worst possible thing you can do as a private equity lawyer. You have to be outcomes focused, and you have to be able to make sure your client is fully informed and has all the advice to make the decision, but you also need to put that in context so that your client, instead of agreeing with the point that you really care about in the drafting, comes to a decision that gets them the outcome that they need and the outcome that the other side needs.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time, and I don't know how we're already 45 minutes in. But one of the things I wanted to do today, and I'm just going to hop to it and then come back to the other questions and the Q&A. But one of the things I wanted to do was have a chance to speak to Sarah and Priya on a case study. Sarah, I don't know if you want to go first, but we've just basically asked Sarah to prepare a short summary of something interesting that she's worked on recently.
So I think, apologies, I've turned my video off. What I was going to tell you was, the first in the life cycle of the transactions we're all doing. So that's generating and creating a fund. So the first part of it, and as I explained before, it's a long process. You tend to work with the general partner to set up and establish a vehicle. You'd look at how you're going to structure that. That's very much often to do with tax. It's to do with where investors are based. So that would be the first thing. You want to do a fund investing in X. Which countries is it investing in? Where do you think your investors are coming from? Where do you have a presence? All those things go into where do we set up this vehicle? And then once you've made those kind of decisions and really tested them against kind of regulatory and tax issues, you'd then go about putting together some basic documents. Now, the first thing that people might go out with is marketing documents, teaser documents, for which they can go and do some pre-marketing and work out, with select clients, who's interested in this product. And from that, we might develop a full prospectus, private placement memorandum. That's the document that sets out from everything from the investment rationale, the deal history of the team, to what this vehicle is going to look like, where it's structured, and some basics around, what the expected outcomes, what the expected returns are likely to be. So we'd often undo that and maybe focus on that. Separately, we'd also need to be drafting up the constitutional documents, principally for investment funds. That's often a limited partnership agreement. They're often set up as partnerships. It's a big, long document and requires quite a lot of work and finessing of terms to reflect what the client wants. Your clients tend to then go out, talk to investors. They start to diligence the project and the product. They will diligence it from a commercial perspective, but also they'll kick the tires on the legals, and they will also negotiate with you around the investment terms and what's in the legal documents. And that negotiation can take some time. It's also being done simultaneously, usually with lots of different investors. And depending on what the kind of comments come back, that might mean there are amendments to the main contractual documents, to the LPA. And maybe at the outset of a transaction, and with a big, investor that's coming in for a big proportion of the fund, that may require you to amend the LPA to accommodate their needs. More commonly, though, we work through bilateral side letters, which are letters agreeing particular terms, particular investors. And that's a big feature of investment funds, that investors often have their own bespoke terms. And so all of that work goes together. What funds tend to do is some of them have one, what we call a closing, where the investors all decide to invest into the fund. They subscribe and say, for example, I'm going to commit 10 million, 100 million to this fund. And that would be called a closing. Most funds operate multiple closings, and they may happen over 18 months, maybe even 2 years. And so you're doing this process maybe every 3 to 6 months with new investors as they get more familiar and they're on their own timelines. And then you get to the stage of doing the closing. At that point, you can then start to draw money from those investors. So what they've normally done is given you a commitment, and investment funds, you tend to draw that money over time as the deals arise and as you need that money. And that's at the stage really that you tend to, our involvement is less. We still sometimes get involved in the life cycle of a fund, and we definitely get involved at the end and its termination, but that tends to cease our involvement. It's very much more moving on to deals, and that's when the PE teams come in. Now, the one caveat to that is quite often these funds may have warehouse deals, may have deals that they're working on in the background. They don't usually wait till all the money's in and then start looking for deals. It's kind of a process that's going on, obviously, all the time. But that's the investment fund bit of the piece. And I think Priya was probably going to talk about the next bit, which is spending the money that we've spent the time getting for you.
Yes, please, Priya. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, so I was going to talk about a recent deal that I worked on that is quite a good example of some of the things that we've touched on today. So it was a deal for PAI, and it was the acquisition of a sound equipment specialist called Audiotonics. So they make premium audio equipment and software that's used by like bands like Coldplay and U2. So it was quite cool because it was a tangible business, which was quite interesting. And the context was it was quite a competitive auction. So there's multiple bidders looking at the same target as us. And so, and in addition to that, the existing institutional investors in the business were looking to roll over and reinvest in the new structure with PAI, albeit for smaller stakes. And there was complexity around how they would structure their reinvestment. So it set the background for quite let's say, not balanced negotiating standpoint, because it was a super hot asset that lots of people were interested in. You've got kind of majority shareholders, existing majority shareholders that are used to having, quite good rights and protections under their existing terms, looking to reinvest for a smaller stake, but they've historically been used to quite good protections. And then the added complexity of institutional investors rolling over, but also a very large number of management sellers who are rolling over. And I think we had something like 8 or 9 different jurisdictions for the different managers and how we structured that. So it meant that the entire negotiation process was super focused on keeping the sell side sweet, because they're going to be your bedfellows for the next 3 to 5 or more years. And also having to take quite a commercial, very measured, focused approach to how we tackled the whole transaction, because not only were we kind of competing against a mass of other interested parties, but also given the number of stakeholders involved, you want to minimize the contentious kind of points in the commercial terms. And so what it meant was that it was a real focusing of the minds. It was really, putting on your commercial advisor hat on and guiding the client to see what the absolute must-haves were rather than the nice-to-haves. And as Leanne mentioned, it's about kind of protecting the things that really matter. And so I just thought it was a good example of a deal which I think we're going to see increasingly more and more with the existing kind of institutional shareholders rolling over into the new transaction. If an asset's really performing well, they're not necessarily going to want to exit fully. And so, just an example of kind of a typical deal that you'd work on in a PE context, and the kind of navigating of structural as well as kind of commercial complexities.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Priya. And I just want to move on now. We've got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to do kind of a mix of audience questions and questions that I have that are fairly similar. So Leanne, just coming to you first, what would you say people in your practice area are currently talking about? Have there been any kind of significant changes or developments in the area recently?
Sure. So one of the fantastic things that I love about working in this area is that geopolitics massively impacts both the number of deals that are happening at any given time, and also the valuations that you can get for companies. So if I give you an example from a management perspective, the new Labour government, for example, has potentially huge impacts on deal flow. And the reason for that is if you are the sell side, as I said, normally you sell a bit of your stake if you're the management team and then you reinvest. At the moment, you are the tax that you get on that. You don't pay income tax on a sale of shares, you pay capital gains tax, which is much less. The new Labour government and previous Conservative governments often talk about changes to capital gains tax. And at the moment, for example, from a sell side perspective, we have got so many deadlines that are the 29th of October because there is a budget coming on the 30th. And it may well be a small possibility, but there is a possibility that that tax position could change, which has huge implications if you're selling your business. So normally some of the peaks in deal flow we get tend to be around sort of big fiscal events, so end of the tax year or when there's a budget. What that of course means is that it creates a buyer's market, because when buyers know that sellers are very keen to exit before a particular date, they can get an edge by, as Priya was saying, by coming in early and promising we can deliver this deal by that tax deadline that you're really worried about. And so, actually this area of law, lots of things happen in the world that means that, deals stop, or deals go much quicker, or people, want to maybe sell slightly before they're ready, or you can drive a higher or a lower price depending on what's going on in the world. And that's where some of our colleagues' sector expertise really helps us as well, because things like changes in the law in a particular sector can also drive deal flow. So I'm sure the other people on this call have the same. I get very helpful updates from some of my sector colleagues saying, oh, by the way, this is happening in the data world, and therefore something your clients might want to think about in the market.
Brilliant, thank you. And Julian, just coming to you, someone's asked about how difficult it is to acclimatize to the different jurisdictions and the intricacies of various laws when you're working on a deal that spans multiple jurisdictions.
I think it's heavily dependent on the quality of your local council, but also how accessible and how similar or different your law that you're dealing with is to your home law, so to the UK. So I mean, I've done quite a few deals in Germany just by chance, not at all connected to the fact that I'm German, because I'm not a German lawyer. And their law is, even though they're very close by geography, their law is actually very different to ours and works in a very different way. So you need to make sure that, I mean, we work with our Skadden office in Frankfurt with that, but I think you need to make sure that you have lawyers who are reliable, who can explain to you how it works. And ultimately that's because you then need to explain to your client how certain things will work, because without that, the client basically needs to know how to structure their investment. So yeah, it can be tricky. It becomes particularly tricky where you have lots of different local councils involved, I'd say. So that happens quite frequently on diligence projects where, I mean, like Priya was saying, she had it where managers were based in different countries, and you then have to structure their reinvestment based on the tax laws of those jurisdictions and mechanics that they use in those jurisdictions. But it happens on diligence as well, where say you're buying a massive conglomerate and they've got subsidiaries in 24 different countries. You've got to do some high level diligence at least on each of those countries to verify you actually own those companies correctly and fully, and you're buying what you think you're buying. So that usually involves you getting all kinds of local lawyers involved and finding out that verifying that you own something in India is a lot more difficult than verifying it in the UK. So yeah, it takes some getting used to, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily easy, but it's just a part of the job that you've got to kind of get accustomed to.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've just hit 1 o'clock, but I'm going to ask one more question. Sorry, Dimitar. Priya, just to close, someone has asked, what advice do you have for students who want to get into this area of law but don't know where to start?
So I think it depends slightly at what level you're at. So if you're still at university, I think there is amazing events that are being put on by various law firms and or kind of like yourselves, right? So speak to people, educate yourselves, like understand what you can about what the area is actually all about, because any kind of education on that side of things, or reading materials about this, is going to help shape your application for training contracts and then seat applications in due course. So it's all kind of additive. And then I would say, if you're kind of already have training contracts lined up, or you're wondering how to kind of advocate for yourself for wanting to be getting a chance to do a seat in this department, I would say speak up. Like, no one's going to advocate harder for your career than yourself. It's the best bit of advice I got right early on. People love people that are keen and interested. So if you're in that later stage and you're starting at a firm shortly, speak to associates in the team that are in that department. Go to any kind of team events or speak to the relevant partners. So I think, there's a lot of material out there, and there's lots to educate yourself on. So I would say those are the kind of key bits.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we could go on for a whole another 2 hours, but I'm going to stop now. Sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, but just a huge thank you to the panelists. I'm going to quickly hand back over to Dimitar to close.
Thank you. Some really great insights. And yes, this is unfortunately all that we have time for. I'm just going to quickly run one more poll to link back to the start to get an idea of what the attendees might have learned. Poll should be up now. If you could please answer. Few more seconds. Okay, I'm just going to share the results. So majority of you, 89% actually, have said that you know what the work of a solicitor in this area involves, which is amazing because this is what the session is all about. Thank you for that. It's great to see what you've taken from this session. Before you go, just another reminder to attendees that we'll be sending out a link containing the recorded session, so please keep an eye out for that. And a survey will also pop up once this masterclass finishes. So please fill this out in order to let us know how you enjoyed today and what other topics you would like to see us cover in the future. Remember to check out all our upcoming masterclasses on the events page on lawcareers.net. The link to which will be also in the follow-up email. And thank you very much once again to our amazing panelists and to everyone attending today. And we look forward to seeing you again next time.